Mark Whitmore wasn't the type to get spooked easily. A retired science teacher with more patience than most, he spent his days tending to his immaculate garden at the back of his quiet suburban home. Rows of tomatoes stood like soldiers, thick vines, lush leaves, and ruby-red fruit that glistened in the sun like polished gems. He'd grown them from seed, babied them through storms, and even whispered encouragement to them like some botanical priest. But this morning, something felt wrong. He stood motionless at the edge of the patch, watering can dangling from his hand. Half a dozen tomatoes were missing. Not fallen, not nibbled, not rotting. Gone. The stems were still intact, cleanly plucked. It was surgical. Mark frowned, running a calloused finger over the empty stalk. He knew his garden like the lines on his palm. These weren't random pickings. These were hand-selected. Only the ripest, most flawless ones were taken. Not a single green one touched. At first, he told himself it had to be an animal. Raccoons, maybe, or possums. But deep down, he knew better. No animal would be that picky, and no animal closed the gate behind them. He swung it shut and gave it a tug. The latch clicked. Firm. He'd locked it every night since the last time, when 3 tomatoes vanished. At the time, he'd chalked it up to memory, or maybe birds. But birds didn't open latches, and they sure didn't know how to choose the best fruit. A low unease began to curl in his stomach. Over the next week, it happened again. And again. Always the same pattern. Only the perfect ones. Never a mess left behind. Always at night. Mark began leaving little traps. Nothing harmful. A strip of foil here, some chalk dust on the gate hinge, a string tied across the path. The foil was bent one morning. The chalk had smudged. But there were never any footprints. Just missing tomatoes and silence. Something, or someone, was getting in. One night, Mark sat by the kitchen window long after midnight, mug in hand, eyes trained on the garden bathed in moonlight. The tomatoes glowed softly in the dark, almost taunting him. At exactly 3:11 a.m., the motion sensor light flicked on for a moment, and then went off. He rushed out barefoot, heart thundering. But the yard was still. Too still. The next morning, 5 more tomatoes were gone. This wasn't just theft. It felt personal. Like someone knew how much they meant to him. Like someone was watching. He couldn't prove it. Not yet. But something deep in his bones told him this was only the beginning. He looked out over his garden one more time and whispered under his breath, "Okay, let's play." The tomatoes weren't disappearing randomly. Mark saw it now. There was a pattern. Always 3 to 5 tomatoes. Always the biggest. Always the ones closest to the fence. And always every 3 nights. Whoever was doing this didn't just know tomatoes. They knew his tomatoes. It was precision. Ritual. Almost respectful. Which made it worse. By the end of the second week, Mark had turned his quiet little garden into a silent battlefield. He stopped gardening for joy. It became a game of chess. He placed decoy tomatoes. Overripe ones. Bruised ones. They were never touched. The thief wasn't hungry. They were choosing. He started a notebook. Logged everything. Time of disappearance. Weather. Moon phase. Even wind direction. He checked the latch obsessively. Wiped for prints. Dusted with flour for tracks. Nothing. Not even a smudge. Every time, it was as if the tomatoes had just vanished. The gate, untouched. The soil, unmoved. The silence, deafening. Mark took to sleeping in the recliner by the back window. Curtains cracked. Lights off. Thermos of coffee by his side. He stared into that garden for hours, night after night, eyes scanning for movement. Sometimes he thought he saw a flicker, a shape. But when he rushed outside, the yard was always empty. Still. Wrong. The sense of being watched had grown unbearable. He could feel it even in daylight, like eyes tracing the back of his neck whenever he turned his back to the tomato beds. And then came the sixth hit. Only 2 tomatoes were taken. That was the first deviation. But something else was left behind, subtle, almost invisible. On one of the vines, woven in tight, was a single black thread. It was too deliberate to be an accident. He plucked it gently, inspecting it under the porch light. Synthetic, strong, like nylon from a glove. Mark's hands clenched around it. This was no longer about curiosity. This was targeted. He glanced back at the garden. It wasn't just his tomatoes being violated. It was his space, his life. Someone was crossing a line, inch by inch, smiling behind the mask of darkness. And the worst part, Mark didn't even know why. Why him? Why tomatoes? Why so cleanly? The thought that haunted him the most wasn't that someone was stealing from him. It was the growing, gnawing fear that someone was sending a message, and he hadn't figured out what it was yet. That night, as the wind whispered through the vines, and the motion light flickered without cause, Mark stood barefoot in the yard, heart pounding. He stared into the shadows and muttered under his breath, "You're watching me." But now I'm watching back. Mark started watching the neighborhood with new eyes. It wasn't just his garden under siege. It was his peace. The slow, predictable rhythm of his retired life had been shattered. And when someone violates your sanctuary, you start questioning everything. And everyone. Especially the ones who keep to themselves. Like Janet. She lived 2 streets over, in the last house on Hemlock Lane. A fading blue place with shuttered windows, and a yard that hadn't seen a mower in months. Mark had only spoken to her once years ago, when she asked for directions to the hardware store. There was something distant in her eyes, something hollow, like she was listening for a sound no one else could hear. And now he noticed something he hadn't before. She always walked around dusk, hood up, bag slung low across her shoulder. No dog, no groceries, just aimless pacing. Sometimes she paused near his fence, just for a second, then moved on. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't threatening. But it was off. Mark mentioned her casually to Alan, the old mailman who still walked his route even after retirement. "You ever talk to that woman on Hemlock? Janet?" Alan scratched his chin. "Yeah, a couple times. Kind of strange, right? Heard she's been living there since her husband died. Doesn't say much to anyone. Keeps weird hours." Mark leaned in. "Think she'd steal tomatoes?" Alan raised an eyebrow. "She'd steal something, that's for sure. Heard she's been caught poking around vacant houses. Even saw her digging in her own front yard once." "Middle of the night." "Digging?" Mark asked. Alan nodded, with a flashlight in her mouth, like she was looking for something. The conversation stuck with him like a splinter. Later that night, Mark stood by the garden with a flashlight, scanning the edges of his fence. Near the eastern post, just a few feet from where the tomatoes had gone missing, he spotted something half buried in the dirt. He crouched down, brushed it gently with his fingers. A hairpin. Simple, black, old-fashioned. And clinging to it, just barely, was a long gray-blonde hair. The same shade Janet wore in a loose braid under that hood. Mark stared at the pin in his hand, a cold wave spreading through his chest. Could it really be her? A quiet, grieving widow sneaking through yards and stealing tomatoes in the dead of night. Why? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft creak. The motion light clicked on. He whipped around. Nothing there. But the gate was slightly ajar. He hadn't left it open. Mark backed toward the porch, heart pounding louder than his footsteps. He clutched the hairpin in his fist and whispered like it might hear him. "If you're trying to scare me, Janet, it's starting to work." Mark wasn't sleeping anymore. He tried, sure, curtains drawn, lights off, head on the pillow. But his mind kept crawling back to that open gate, the hairpin, and a creeping feeling that he was always one step behind. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined someone. No, something. Slipping through his garden like fog. That's when he called his nephew, Jason. Ex-military, hunter, tech-savvy. A guy who didn't believe in ghosts, just in evidence. "I need cameras," Mark told him. "You want motion detection?" Jason asked, already tapping into his truck bed toolbox. "Night vision." Mark nodded. "And I want them silent. I don't want her, whoever she is, to even know she's being watched." Jason grinned and pulled out 2 black weatherproof units. "Trail cams. I call these the Reapers. They don't miss a damn thing." They mounted the Reapers that evening, just before dusk. One was tucked into the tomato vines, cleverly masked behind a fake flower pot. The other was rigged to the fence post, its lens barely peeking through a crack in the wood. Both were motion-activated. Both had infrared night vision. Mark watched the garden from his porch as the sky turned to ash and the wind picked up. The garden didn't sway like it usually did. It twitched, like it knew something was coming. The tomatoes glistened unnaturally under the moonlight. Red, wet, vulnerable. He didn't move all night. Sat in silence, just watching. At 3:08 a.m., the motion light flickered. Once, twice. Then darkness. He froze, barely breathing. Nothing. No footsteps. No sound. No gate creak. But in his gut, he felt it. Something had just passed through. The next morning, Mark didn't even check the tomatoes. He went straight to the laptop, slotted the Reaper's memory cards, and pulled up the footage. For 10 seconds, he saw only grainy shadows, the still garden, the faint flutter of leaves. And then she emerged. A figure, shrouded in a loose coat and scarf, moved with eerie purpose. No flashlight, no noise. Her hands hovered over each tomato, pausing before she gently plucked 3 from the vine. Not rushed, not scared, ritualistic. Then she turned, and for just 1 second, 1 terrifying second, she looked directly at the hidden camera. No smile, no expression, just wide, glassy eyes that seemed to see through the lens. Mark paused the frame, zoomed in. It was her, Janet. But something was off. Her face was pale, too pale, like wax. And around her neck, just barely visible in the image, hung a necklace with something odd dangling from it. It was a shriveled tomato. Dry, blackened, preserved like a charm. Mark sat back in his chair, a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. This wasn't just theft anymore. It was obsession. Or maybe devotion. And for the first time, he wondered if the tomatoes were the target at all. Or just the bait. Mark stared at the frozen frame, his pulse throbbing in his ears. The woman, Janet, was perfectly centered in the shot, eyes wide and blank, like she'd been waiting for the lens to find her. The grainy footage made her look almost translucent, unreal, a shadow that didn't belong to this world. And yet the tomatoes were still gone. Proof, right there. She was real, tangible, alive. Wasn't she? He rewound the clip and played it again, slower. There was something wrong with how she moved. No bounce, no sway. Her limbs floated more than they swung, like she was being pulled forward by invisible strings. Her head barely turned, even when she changed direction. Then came the part that froze the breath in Mark's lungs. As she stepped away with the tomatoes cradled in her arms, the camera caught one final image. Her hand reaching into her coat pocket, pulling something out. She bent low to the garden soil and buried it. Mark slammed his laptop shut and raced outside. It was early morning, but the sky was still bruised with fog, the ground damp from the night. He knelt at the exact spot she'd crouched, dug into the dirt with his bare hands, and found it within seconds. Wrapped in crumbling cloth and twine was a button. Large, wooden, cracked down the middle, with a faint carving on its surface. A name. Eli. Mark stared at it, stomach lurching. It didn't belong to him. It wasn't from any of his clothes, and it had the feel of something very old. He turned it over and saw a smudge of dried red underneath. tomato juice, or something darker. Suddenly, he heard it. A creak. The garden gate. He shot to his feet and turned. Nothing. No wind. No movement. But the gate, it was swinging ever so slightly, as if someone had just slipped through. Mark backed away slowly, the button still clutched in his palm. Inside, he tried to call Jason. No answer. He texted. Nothing. The laptop sat on the table, still open to the last paused frame of Janet's face. He zoomed in once more. This time, not on her eyes, on her necklace. That shriveled tomato, it wasn't just strung by twine. It was sewn. With hair. Long, silver strands threaded through its skin like ritualistic stitches. Mark stumbled back from the screen. This wasn't theft. This wasn't mischief. This was ritual. And she wasn't doing it for fun. She was doing it for someone else. He looked out at the garden through the window. The tomatoes sat silent, red, ripe, waiting. And Mark realized something chilling. He hadn't planted them in that soil. That patch of earth, the one where she always went, it was untouched last season. He'd never planted there. So who had? And what was really growing beneath? Mark didn't sleep that night. Not even for a minute. He sat in the dim kitchen, lights off, the glow of the paused footage still flickering across his face. Janet's hollow stare stared back at him from the screen like a ghost suspended in time. That stitched tomato. The name Ely carved into a wooden button. The hair thread. The ritualistic thefts. All of it was circling like vultures over something buried, literally, in his garden. But who was Eli? Why that name? At dawn, he drove to the local town hall. The clerk looked half asleep until Mark dropped Janet's full name on the counter. Janet Miriam Cole. The woman's fingers paused above her keyboard. "You said you live on Laurel Street," she asked cautiously. Mark nodded. The clerk hesitated, then typed. "She's been flagged for erratic behavior. Nothing criminal. Just oddities. Reports from neighbors." "Like what?" Mark asked. "Digging up public flower beds. Leaving fruit in plastic wrap at bus stops. Once filled a mailbox with marigolds and honey." She clicked again. "She's lived alone since her son died." Mark stiffened. Her son. The woman lowered her voice. "Eli Cole. Drowned in the old quarry. 13 years old." It was big news back then. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Tomatoes were his favorite. The clerk added quietly. She used to bring him one every day in his lunchbox. When Mark got home, the wind had picked up, rustling the garden like whispers. The soil seemed darker now, wetter, thirstier. And that patch, the one Janet always visited, looked different, not just disturbed, almost fresher, like someone had recently turned it from beneath. He grabbed a shovel. With each dig, the earth gave off a pungent, metallic scent. Worms scattered. A root snapped with a wet pop. 6 inches down, he found it. A box. Weathered, wooden, nailed shut. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, wrapped in layers of brittle cloth, was a child's lunchbox. Rusted, blue. Cartoon spaceman faded on the lid. Inside, still intact, was a shriveled tomato, hardened like leather, laying beside a hand-drawn photo. A boy, maybe 13, smiling in crayon. His name, scrawled at the bottom. Eli. For Mom. Mark reeled back, heart thundering. The soil hadn't just grown tomatoes. It had been fed them. He looked at the rows again, each vine more vibrant than the last, swollen with unnatural growth. These weren't vegetables anymore. They were altars, gifts to something or someone. Beneath, a shadow moved behind the fence. He turned fast, but no one was there. Then he saw it. A single tomato had been placed on the porch railing. Deliberately, perfectly centered. A message. He stepped toward it slowly. It was carved. 4 letters, scratched deep into the skin. Mark stood frozen on the porch, staring at the tomato resting on the railing like a silent sentinel. The carved letters on its smooth red surface burned into his eyes. Mark. He reached out, hands trembling, and touched it gently. Cool. Firm. Almost. Alive. The moment his fingers brushed against the tomato, the hairs on his neck stood on end. It was as though the very air around him shifted. A low, almost imperceptible hum filled the air. His pulse quickened. A rustling sound came from the garden. Soft at first, like wind through the vines. Then louder, more deliberate. Someone, or something, was walking toward him. He spun around, heart hammering in his chest. Janet stood in the garden, framed by the creeping tendrils of the tomatoes. She was too still, like the world had forgotten to move around her. Her eyes, those hollow, glassy eyes, were locked on him. Her pale face, twisted in something between a smile and a grimace, was barely visible under the dark hood. Her mouth didn't move, but the voice came anyway. Clear. Cold. I've kept my promise. Mark's throat went dry. What? What is this? He stammered, stepping back. Why me? Why my tomatoes? Janet didn't answer. Instead, she reached out slowly, and with a soft flick of her wrist, the gate to the garden creaked open. The vines, as if guided by invisible hands, seemed to part, creating a path that led straight to her. The air thickened, saturated with the heavy scent of overripe fruit. Eli needs them, she murmured, her voice far too calm, too resigned. They've always been his. And now, you are part of it. Mark's legs shook as he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the steps. He wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if something was pulling him toward her, something deep and ancient, something buried beneath the soil, something that needed him. She took a step forward, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath her boots. The garden groaned in response, like it was waking from a long slumber. You've seen it, she said, her tone almost pleading now. The harvest is almost complete. But we still need you, Mark. Just one more tomato. One more gift to Eli. Mark's pulse thudded in his ears. No, no more gifts. I'm done with this. You need to leave me alone. But Janet didn't flinch. She only smiled that unnatural smile and took another slow step forward. The sound of roots shifting beneath her feet grew louder. It's already too late, Mark. The garden has chosen, and so have you. The vines shifted again, this time more violently. The ground trembled beneath Mark's feet, the earth groaning in protest. He stumbled backward, feeling the raw pull of the soil beneath him. Then he saw it, just beyond the garden gate. A figure. Dark, twisted. It was Eli. But it wasn't. He was too still, his eyes too empty. His mouth stretched into a grin that was far too wide, far too hungry. He reached out, his fingers curling like claws. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He turned to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. His body was frozen, caught in the grip of something much older than fear. The vines behind him tightened, their tendrils wrapping around his legs. He fell to his knees, hands digging into the dirt. And as he struggled, he saw something that made his stomach churn. A blackened, shriveled tomato resting beside the boy's outstretched hand. A gift. A final gift. Janet's voice was soft, too soft. It's your turn, Mark. You will join us. Eli is waiting. And then, with a sudden snap, the earth closed. The world around Mark dissolved into darkness. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the very earth beneath him had come alive and was swallowing him whole. He gasped, struggling for breath, his fingers scrabbling in the soil as the vines wound tighter around his legs, pulling him deeper into the garden's hungry embrace. Janet's voice, soft and insistent, echoed in his mind. Eli is waiting. His chest tightened. He looked up through the haze, heart racing. The boy, Eli, was standing now, right in front of him, his face an eerie mask of emptiness. His eyes were wide, black as tar, hollowed out by something far darker than grief. Eli reached down slowly, his fingers curling into claws. His breath was heavy, labored, as though the boy's very existence was being stretched too thin. Mark tried to scream, but no sound came out. His lungs were crushed under the weight of something ancient and malevolent. His arms flailed, but the earth refused to release him. And then Mark felt it. A tug in his chest, a pulling sensation deep in his very bones, as though something inside him was reaching out toward the garden, toward the vines, toward Eli. The moment his gaze shifted downward, he saw it. The tomato, the one that had been left on the railing, the one that had called him to the garden, the one with his name carved into its flesh. It was now resting in the soil beside him, its skin starting to crack and peel away, revealing something that made Mark's stomach twist with horror. A face, twisted, contorted. His own face, but with hollow, lifeless eyes, staring up at him in silent accusation. The vines tightened their grip. Mark gasped, choking on the thick, suffocating air. Panic surged through him as he fought to break free, but the earth was pulling him down. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out everything but the terrible pressure, the crushing weight, and the slow realization that he was no longer just Mark. He was part of it now. Part of the garden. Part of the cycle. Janet's voice came again, this time colder, more distant. The harvest is complete. Mark's eyes darted toward her, but she was no longer the frail, lonely widow who had once stood in the garden. She was something else now, otherworldly. Her form shimmered in and out of focus, her features warped like a reflection in a shattered mirror. Her smile was wide, grotesque, stretched unnaturally, as if it had never been meant to be human. "The tomatoes have always been Eli's," she continued, her voice low, echoing like the whispers of forgotten things. "And now they belong to you. The garden feeds us all. It takes, and it gives. You were always meant to be here, Mark. Always." His breath hitched as he watched the vines ripple, the ground vibrating beneath him, as if the entire garden were alive, awake, and waiting. The dark energy of the earth pulsed in waves. And then, as though the very soil had become sentient, it began to shift. The earth trembled. Roots sprouted from the ground, wrapping around his chest, his arms, his legs, lifting him upward, pulling him toward the heart of the garden. The tomatoes around him shimmered, glowing with a strange, otherworldly light. Mark could feel it now. He wasn't just in the garden. He was becoming it. His body went limp as he was pulled deeper into the roots, swallowed by the earth. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw something in the distance. A shadow, a figure standing just beyond the garden gate. And then everything went black. The garden settled into stillness. The vines swayed gently in the breeze, and the tomatoes ripened, glistening red under the sun's dim glow. The earth was satisfied. And somewhere deep beneath, Mark's face, his carved face, smiled, eternally bound to the harvest. This concludes the story. The garden has claimed its final crop, and Mark's fate is sealed in the very soil he once tended. If you'd like to explore more stories or ideas, feel free to ask.